Almost ready. There. All right. How is everyone doing today? Looks like we've got people logging in as expected. Oh, dismiss that. Zoom and YouTube coming along nicely. For those that will be following along on their own text, you're going to want to look at chapter 37 from the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus, and we'll be starting right at the top. All right. Well, I think that's a reasonable amount of wait time to get started. So today we are going to use the text describing the continued construction of the Mishkan and all of its implements and contents as a little bit of a springboard. I hope no one feels that this is going to be a bit of a bait and switch. We are talking about a central piece of the Mishkan, but we are going to be looking at many texts that are not directly attributable to chapter 37. As you'll see, that's rather essential for the topic at hand. Specifically, we are going to be looking at the cheruvim, the cherubs that are on top of the Ark of the Covenant. Now, the term cherub is very well defined in modern English culture. If you ask somebody what a cherub is, assuming they know anything about classical Western civilization, they'll describe something that is roughly like a plump little baby with little wings. They may get it confused with Cupid and think that it also has a bow and arrow, but essentially that's where most people's mind goes when you say the word cherub. As we're going to see, the Torah itself does not make it at all clear what the cheruvim, the angels on top of the Ark of the Covenant, resembled in any part of our world. But there are clues from many other texts, and many of those clues have been distilled into commentary by many of our ancestors. So we're going to try and figure out what they might have looked like, but we're also going to try and figure out why they were there in the first place, which is, of course, usually the more interesting of the two questions. But if we have no idea even what they were meant to resemble, then it might be hard to put them into their proper context. So with that, let's dive in just to be reminded of the text. But as I said, we're going to be leaping out of the text into a wide tour of different, cherubs. So 37, verse 1. Oh, and my mouse disappeared. There we go. Can't scroll the screen without the mouse. Bezalel made the Ark of Acacia Wood 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, and 1.5 cubits high. Reminder that a cubit is roughly 18 inches for those of you trying to do the math at home. And this is talking about the Ark, the Aron, that is the actual Ark of the Covenant that we've talked about in passing before. And he overlaid it with pure gold inside and out, and he made a gold molding for it round about. All of this, of course, is in keeping with what we had read before about the construction of the Mishkan. He cast 4 gold rings for it, 4 for its feet, 2 rings on one of its side walls, and 2 rings on the other. He made poles of acacia wood, overlaid them with gold, and inserted the poles into the rings on the side walls of the ark for carrying the ark. So we have these rings on each side, and this wooden pole that was wrapped in gold was used as the main implement for lifting and carrying. Verse 6, he made a cover of pure gold, 2.5 cubits long and 1.5 cubits wide. He made 2 cherubim, or cheruvim. I'll probably be switching back and forth between the two pronunciations as we go through, or just saying cherubs. He made 2 of the cherubim of gold. He made them of hammered work at the ends of the cover. So we've got this idea that we have these 2 cherubim. not being explained what they resemble, but apparently this was familiar enough to the original audience. And they are made from gold. They are hammered work, hammered sculptured, and they sit on the corners or the ends rather of the kaporet, the lid of the ark. Verse 8, one cherub at one end and the other cherub at the other end, just making sure that we understood that when it says the two of them were at the ends, that it meant not two at one end, but one at each end. And he made the cherubim of one piece with the cover at its two ends. So they are sculpted from the gold, if you will, hammered out of the gold so that it is all one fused piece rather than being bolted or soldered to the top. The cherubim had their wings spread out above, shielding the cover with their wings over the top of the lid. They faced each other. The faces of the cherubim were turned toward the cover. All right, so this is the most detail we get about what they look like. But as you can tell, it's still a little, well, sparse. We know that they have wings. Great. That is uniquely there. We know they have faces. Again, very important detail. We also get something about the orientation of these two figures on the top of the Aron. We get that not only are they each at the ends, but that they are facing towards each other, but also that their faces are turned down. Now, how can you be facing each other and facing down? Well, the usual depiction of that is that they are oriented, pointed towards each other, but that their actual face is angled downward. So that way they are facing each other and facing the cover, the lid at the same time. And again, that phrase that their wings are spread out above is a little bit open for interpretation. It says that the wings are spread out upwards, would be another way to translate the phrase lamala. But it definitely says that those wings are shielding, are acting as schach, literally the same word we use for the roof of a sukkah, over the top of the lid. So the wings go up and they go over. And then we're on to the table. So that's it. That's what we've got. And from there, we then move into other references throughout the Tanakh about cheruvim. And then later on, we get artistic representations of this item. And that's about it. Now, before we move on to our commentary about the cheruvim in particular, I do want to remind you that although we're not going to look up the texts together, that there were also cheruvim that were sculpted or woven into the curtains of the Mishkan as well. That these were not only on the ark, but that they were also part of the curtain work. We also know that there were even larger cheruvim that were part of the Temple of Solomon, that were sort of over the ark itself, meaning that you would have had the cheruvim on the ark and then cheruvim in the room where the ark was kept as well. So this is not the only place that we get a cherub. We see these figures cropping up throughout the Mishkan, the temple items. But of course, a cherub does not only appear with regards to the Mishkan. This is a more common subcategory of malach, of angel, that appears in multiple places. And from some of the others, we will be looking for explanation. But before we dive into some of those other places and some of the other explanations, just any questions that people have on this section of the text from chapter 37. As long as the question isn't, so what do they look like?
Well, my question is really one. I guess we'll see it in the text you've selected, but we've encountered this idea of cherubim already in Genesis. So using Rambam's approach, I would assume that might be one of the starting places we're going to look at.
Absolutely. We are going back to Genesis 3 as soon as we go to the commentary.
Great, thank you.
Because that is, as you're pointing out, the first appearance of a cherub, of one of these creatures found in the entire Torah. Indeed, it is the first angelic sort of entity that we get a reference to at all in the entire Torah. So yes, it's not only wise to go back to the beginning when things are first mentioned. It also happens that in the nature of Jewish commentary, most commentators will begin with a first instance and have longer discussions than they will by the time they get to the second, third, fourth mention of a particular thing. That is why if you look at the commentary on chapter 37, you'll find less than you will on the chapters in the 20s that deal with the building of the Mishkan, because most commentators feel that they don't need to discuss the construction as much as the design, which was already given to us prior to Ki Tisa. So absolutely, we're heading back to chapter 3 because that's where a lot of the interesting commentary gets made. And then we'll be jumping back to the 20s where more commentary gets made about the Mishkan particularly. That's why I said I hope no one feels this is a bait and switch, just because we're not going to be looking at commentary only on chapter 37. It's simply that these topics have come up in other chapters already, so we go where the commentary already exists. All right, well, with that in mind, let's go back and take a look at what the different ideas about chapter 3 in Genesis are. Now, if you need a little bit of a reminder, the reason why a cherub is appearing at the beginning of the book of Genesis is because it is positioned near Gan Eden, near the Garden of Eden, and that it is there with some type of fiery or lighting lit blade or sword, and it is protecting, guarding in some way the path back into Gan Eden, into the Garden of Eden. And so we have to ask, well, what does it look like? We know that it's got something sword-like, but what did it actually look like, and what purpose did it serve? So Chizkuni gives us, in his usual brief fashion, a description that isn't much of a description. Right? The cherubim were creatures whose very appearance frightened all those who merely looked at them. So we don't know whether it had a face like a person, a face like a child, a face like an ox. What we know from Chizkuni, and what he believes is the essential element, is that the thing about the cherub is that they were terrifying, that when you looked at them, you were afraid, that whatever we want to describe its appearance to be in some comparison to a human or earthly object, we should understand that its primary purpose, its primary appearance, its primary impact on those who saw it was fear. And that appears to be its actual goal. And certainly in the case of a cherub that was standing at the entrance to the Garden of Eden, whatever that might mean in either literal or metaphorical sense, it does appear that fear was an essential element of its job. And as such, Chizkuni focuses on that. Now, this is something we're going to have to balance back and forth, because we do want to sort of figure out what they might have looked like in a physical way, but we should also recognize that whatever they looked like, they had a purpose. And often that purpose is more discernible than their unique features. Also, just at the offset, and hopefully this won't make you just quit, we also have to understand that the cheruvim, like all the malachim, don't have a set physical form. They are not made up of molecules and atoms. You can't get out a yardstick and measure them. That they appear to people through a spiritual revelation. They're not just walking down the street. So we also have to understand that many of the Nevi'im, the different prophets, might have encountered what is a cherub within the hierarchy of the malachim, of the angels, and still describe it differently, because each of them would have apprehended their the essence of that moment in a different way, a different translation of their experience into language, and as such, the particulars, descriptive features might get a little confused. Now, does that mean we just throw up our hands and give up? No, because the different descriptions are still indicative of something about its essence and about its role. So while we should always have the absolute understanding that we will never be able to paint a cherub as it actually looks, because it lacks a physical form made of atoms and molecules, nonetheless, the way it looks to those who encounter it can still be discussed and is still important for understanding its role within those encounters. So that is the footnote at the beginning to be a little bit of a caveat, so that as we argue back and forth about what it looked like, you realize this isn't like two people arguing about what an elephant looks like. This is two people arguing about what their experience looked like, and it will look different to different participants. All right, now Radak is going to focus a little bit differently on the details that are given here in chapter 3. They, meaning the cherubim, were beings who appeared to the onlookers just like cherubs, in order to put fear into Adam, to discourage him from attempting to return to Gan Eden. So you'll see already introducing, and something that will be referenced by other commentators, that there are cherubs and there are cherub-like cherubs, meaning that there can be a cherub that is an actual cherub, and there can be a creature that is, or rather a divine entity, a spiritual entity, one of the other malachim, a created force for God's will, that looks like, has similar attributes to a cherub. And Radak seems to be saying that the guardian of Gan Eden was a cherub-like entity, something that God had created for this purpose, and it borrowed some of the things that we associate with a cherub in order to make that point. In this case, fear. Seeing that the sword was not real, but only appeared so to Adam, the Torah speaks of the blade of the sword and not the sword itself. When this fire or flame keeps revolving around itself, as described here, this increases the fear inspired in the person watching such a spectacle. As we see from Ezekiel 32:10, we have a similar expression when God is described as frightening people by brandishing my sword. So Radak is drawing our attention to the almost surreal or dreamlike quality of this keruv that is at the entrance to Gan Eden. That it is not a physical creature, it doesn't have an actual sword, but the movement of the fire is reminiscent of the blade of a sword. And it does the same purpose, which is when someone brandishes a weapon, you are afraid. And that fear was necessary in order to prevent an inappropriate return to Gan Eden. And as we see from his continued text, that all matters greatly as the metaphor is extended. There is an additional element in this. That is, the spectacle is meant to inspire in Adam feelings of remorse over what he had done. Once Adam felt remorse, the way would be paved to full repentance. Tshuva. Once he had done tshuva, the frightening spectacle would disappear, and he would return to the garden from time to time, alternating between performing work there and working the soil outside. So this is based off a midrash in Bereshit Rabbah, with the idea that Adam was not permanently banned from Gan Eden, that he actually did later in life have access to return to the Gan as well as to the world that we live in. And that idea of moving between that world of perfection and the world of imperfection is a very powerful one. When you look at the metaphor that Radak is drawing our attention to, that the only thing keeping us from that Gan Eden is our inability to do tshuva, our inability to feel remorse. That if we feel remorse, then the fear goes away. If we do tshuva, then the fear goes away. That when we recognize our mistakes and we admit to them, and we allow ourselves to then fix the errors and to rectify ourselves as well as the consequences of our bad behavior, that the fear that is keeping us from being in that state of perfection that God had created for humanity, that fear goes away and we enter into that state. It is a remarkable metaphor for the almost enlightenment that can be attained through the power of tshuva, of finding that moment of peace and of acceptance through the path of tshuva. And Radak transferring the Midrash from Bereshit Rabbah to us, I think is really doing a splendid job of trying to show us that this isn't just about a creature at the threshold of a very nice central park, that this is a metaphor for humans' struggle with themselves, with their relationship with God, with their relationship to the world, and finding their way into it, or into that higher state of being through the gift of repentance and tshuva, and that is the ultimate antidote to fear. So that was probably a little metaphysical, a little mystical, but I just want to make sure we understand that this cherub is not necessarily an entity there striking people down with a sword, but is sometimes seen more as a spiritual concept, which can be overcome not by beating it in a sword fight, but by overcoming our own feelings of remorse by doing tshuva. Questions or comments on Radak's interpretation?
I question is it the fear that's prompting the repentance, the tshuva, the fear, the angels representing, fear of punishment? Is that what it's supposed to connote?
So I think it's not fear per se in the pure modern English term. It's fear in the sense of overwhelming awe, of being made to feel small in the vastness of the world and in the vastness compared to God. That to encounter this malach, this angelic force that God has put into our life, is to recognize that our life really should be guided by God. And when we realize that it hasn't been, that we have been transgressing the commandments and living badly, we should feel a sense of, I can't believe I'm doing this. This is like waking up in the middle of a driver's seat and you realize that you're going 120 miles an hour on an icy road. It's just, what am I doing? And you slow down and you stop the car, and then the fear goes away. Because it's not the angel's idea that a person should be terrified. It's that the angel's purpose is that a person should be recognizing that what they are doing is wrong, and that emotion is most akin to fear in biblical poetry, because it does shake us to our core, and it does force us to behave differently in a way that fear does for other circumstances as well. A person afraid of a bear is going to bar the door. That is, a change of their behavior because they are worried about that situation. And in this case, a person is supposed to be in such awe of God to recognize that, no, entry to the garden isn't about pushing God out of the way. It's not about pushing yourself in despite your mistakes and bad behavior. It's about recognizing that you have to let go of that in order to truly enter. All right, but it still doesn't tell us what it looks like. And even Rashi's idea about what cheruvim are in general, he says, is that they are in the same place, that they are angels of destruction. All right, we get the idea. These are like really terrible in the sense of fear-inducing creatures. People who encounter them are filled with fear. That can be a therapeutic and helpful way, like Radak says, but why? And what did they actually look like? Which is a little hard to jive, because Rashi, reading from the Talmud from Sukkot 5a, says that these creatures had a child's face. So this is one of the places where, channeling through the Talmud, we see that the Western motif of drawing a cherub as a child is not entirely opposite of Jewish tradition. The idea of fat, pudgy little children that are all like happy and just holding up banners, okay, that may be going a little too far. But the idea that the child's face would be the face of a cherub is something that we're going to have to try and explore. Because how do we reconcile a child's face with this creature of destruction? How do we reconcile a child's face with the fear that is clearly believed to go along with encountering one of these creatures? And is that the only form they take? For Rashi himself again says in Exodus 26 that when talking about the different decorations of cherubim, that it would have on the curtains different creatures, that maybe there isn't a one-size-fits-all cherub, that maybe the Arc cherubim had these children faces, but maybe other cherubim could have different faces. And this is opening the door to the idea that with a cherub, we might be dealing with a species, if you will, rather than a particular subspecies. Think of it like dealing with dog breeds. Someone could say that a cherub is like a dachshund, at which point we all can have a nice clear image of a dachshund and we're good. But on the other hand, it could be that the word cherub really means dog or guard dog, meaning a category or style of dog. And it could look like a Doberman Pinscher, it could look like a German Shepherd, it could look like a Rottweiler, it could look like a Bull Terrier. There's so many different things that it might look like that all look very different from each other. And we could even expand it to say maybe the word cherub just means scary creature. And as such, it could have multiple different expressions at different times. And that's okay. We've gotten locked in our thinking into thinking that each type or category of angel always looks like a carbon copy of the last one. These different terminologies for different angels may not be trying to talk about their physical experience or physical description as much as the role that they play. And it seems to be that our commentators are saying the role that a cherub plays is in inducing awe, is in being a symbol of power and destruction, and as such creating fear. We'll still have to come back to how that child's face might work into that, but that might be where we are headed. And Rashbam goes on to confirm the idea that Rashi has here, that in one way we might understand the cherub as being like birds. He goes to Ezekiel 28, where it says, as a cherub with protective outstretched wings. And he argues, so it must be a large bird. Rashbam is known for being a very much focused on the pshat, the straightforward contextual meaning of a word. If it's talking about wings, and those are its defining features, then, well, birds are what have wings. So why create this in any other form if we want to describe it? A cherub could just be a very large protective wings, bird with protective wings. And indeed, we know that the ancient world was fascinated by the act of the mother bird. I'm trying to get my arms in the camera shot, hovering with its wings over the top of its young. And stretching out its wings to envelop and protect its young. So why not just, says Rashbam, call it a bird? Because that is what fits this description best from the world around us. We don't need to invent any half-breed creature, any chimera that is being created. Just call it a bird. But he is also a scholar, and he has to make proper reference to the Chachamim. And he points out, yes, our sages, however, understood the word to mean having the faces of young children or toddlers. And this is from that same section of Sukkah 5a in the Talmud. So even as he advances what he thinks is probably the most clear and straightforward explanation of its shape, he does have to acknowledge that that's not the more general definition by the rabbis. Now, does that mean these two are at odds? Well, no. At the end of the day, yes, the ark had to have one appearance or another. At the end of the day, the figures that were woven into the different tapestries had to look one way or another. Unlike the actual angelic experience that an individual prophet may have, a hanging tapestry is going to look like something. And a ark that is hammered out of gold is going to look like something. But he may be trying to indicate that it could have looked like a bird, even if the people, the sages, were talking about the faces of children. And that is something that we will come back to. But before we get that, now that we have bird faces and human faces, we've got another type of face that we need to discuss. And this one is coming from the Bechor. These are angels in the form of bulls, and they are called cherubim in reference to plowing, as the Talmud, Bava Batra 12a, references the plowing season as the days of karva, when the ground is dry and it takes longer to plow. So based off the text in the Talmud, which uses that phrase of karva as another synonym for the time of plowing, that karva is the same letters as the word keruv, and so he sees it as being a not exactly a pun, but it is based off the similarity of root letters as being, well, what do you plow with? You plow with an ox, so a cherub must have had ox-like features. Now, it's important to note that if you go to the British Museum or many other places around the world that have the carvings and symbols of the ancient Near Eastern empires, you will find creatures that are winged oxes or that are sphinx-like creatures, bodies of lions, wings, and then with a human face. You will find many such creatures, some of them that have bird heads, all across the different gates and inscriptions that are meant to symbolize different angelic creatures. So it may very well be that this would have been the common conception for our ancestors, having been exposed to many of those Near Eastern influences. And he points out that it's not only the similarity of word, but also Ezekiel refers to the image of a bull in one place and a cherub in another when describing God's chariot, the famous Merkava vision of Ezekiel. And the Talmud, again back in Sukkah, as well as in Chagiga 13b, noting Ezekiel's contradiction, that there is both a cherub and an ox, explains that the cherub looks like a child, meaning that it's a human face. So trying to say that, well, if he says ox on one face and he says a human on another, then clearly they must be different. Moreover, Ezekiel was trying to rectify the image of God's throne by replacing the image of the calf with the image of the calf with the innocuous image of a child. However, the simple reading is that Ezekiel saw a combined image of a bull cherub as one and the same. So Bechor is saying he mentioned the human as a way of trying to transform the image of the cow because, well, let's be honest, we messed up with the cow. Just in last week's parasha of Ki Tisa, we talked about the whole golden calf incident, not as our class, but I mean when we read that Torah portion. And we know that the cow became a major sticking point for the northern kingdom of Israel following the civil war. So yeah, maybe talking about cows would be a problem. So maybe that image of a cow transformed into something that was not quite as referencing to our sin, instead referencing to something that is by definition sinless, meaning a child. Remembering that in Judaism, every child is born without sin. Every child is born incapable of sinning, not incapable of doing wrong things, but incapable of having their transgressions count, if you will, to their spiritual life until they have reached the age of maturity. So the image of a child as the opposition to the image of a bull, the image of that which is sinless to that which is the symbol of some of our greatest sins, would make a lot of sense to try and remind us of that path. Again, going back to what Radak said about that whole notion of a cherub standing at the threshold of Gan Eden as really being a switch between thinking of doing the sins and of regretting doing tshuva and overcoming that fear and becoming sinless through the process of tshuva. It is really the transformation between being stubborn as an ox and sinning with the ox and moving to being as sinless as a child. And he goes on to say, since initially Adam was placed in the Garden of Eden to work it and guard it, but when he was expelled from the garden, God put cherubs in the garden to work it, the cherub being a plow animal, and to guard it, hence the sword. So he sees more poetic justice here, that if man is not going to work the garden, then the cherubim must, and therefore it only makes sense that they be a plow-worthy creature. All right, a lot there. You can always hit pause and go back and review it, but any questions or comments right now? All right. So no discussion of angels is ever complete without a reference to the Moreh Nevochim, the guide for the perplexed. And here we come with Rambam's explanation, not just of angels, well, a bit of what he says about angels, but more importantly, why these particular angels were on this particular structure, meaning the ark itself, the Aron. Why were these put on the lid? It is clear that the belief in the existence of angels is connected with the belief in the existence of God, and the belief in God and angels leads to the belief in prophecy and in the truth of law. So what he's saying is that there is a normal sequence for most people, that when you come to accept the existence of God, when you come to accept the existence of those things that God has created that we call angels, that leads almost inexorably to an understanding that this God chose to share, sometimes through the angels or sometimes more directly, as in the case of Moses, prophecy, revelation, and that the fundamental core of that prophecy was Torah, was the commandments, were the mitzvot. So once you accept the idea of God, and then you move through prophecy and then to law, you are on the right path of life. And this is one reason, of course, why he structures his 13 principles of faith in precisely that order. Now, the belief, in order to firmly establish this creed, God commanded to make over the ark the form of two angels. So since angels as a element are important for this cycle or path of belief, we would put them on the ark in order to help it along. The belief in the existence of angels is thus inculcated into the minds of the people, and this belief is in importance next to the belief in God's existence. It leads us to believe in prophecy and in the law, and opposes idolatry. So God wants us to believe in angels because the angels were a primary vehicle, according to Rambam in particular, of the transmission of God's will into the world itself, that they were a conduit, if you will. They were the means by which God would often bring things into existence, and most importantly, of course, revelation to the prophets. So you really, really want people to believe that there are malachim, that there are these messengers between God and the earthly realm. This is also in direct opposition to the more Aristotelian views of Rambam's day, that believed that there was a God, but that God was detached, was separate, was unable to interact with our world because God's perfection prevented God from connecting to our imperfect realm. And Rambam, of course, disagrees with that vehemently and believes that malachim, angels, are one explanation of God's contact and connection with this world. So they form a vital part of his theology. But that last section about opposing idolatry may cause you a little pause. After all, aren't these little statues on the top of the ark idols? I mean, they are statues of a heavenly creature. put in the middle of a place of worship. That it seems like that sounds like idolatry to me. Well, he has an explanation for that is based upon the details of the construction that we read. If there had only been one figure of a cherub, the people would have been misled and would have mistaken it for God's image, which was to be worshipped in the fashion of the heathen. Or they might have assumed that the angel was also a deity and thus would have adopted a dualism. So he's saying, you're right. If there had been only one angel on the top of the Aron, that probably would have become the symbol of God, and people would have thought it was God, or people would have thought it was a second God, and therefore we now have multiple gods. But by making two cherubim and distinctly declaring, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, also known as the Shema, Moses clearly proclaimed the theory of the existence of a number of angels. By putting more than one, he's saying, there's more than one. There are angels. And when you put there are angels, plural, next to God is one, then Moses clearly proclaimed that, and he left, therefore, no room for the error of considering these figures as deity, since God is one, and that he is the creator of angels who are more than one, right? By having two angels and then having the declaration that God is one, it is the ultimate way of getting rid of the notion of idolatry. If God is one, if that is the defining element of God, and then I put two angels next to each other, I can now tell you clearly they're not gods, because God is one and they are two. If God is one and they are two, they aren't gods. So Rambam sees this as being a very simple mathematics lesson for the average Israelite that would have seen the ark, would have seen the angels on top of it, would have thought, yes, God reaches to the world through the creation of these heavenly beings, but they ain't God. And I know they're not God because there's one sentence that every Jew remembers is God is one, and I can see two of them right now. So in his normal logical structure, Rambam is explaining one of the reasons why we might hold that these two angels would have been put onto that ark in the first place, as a reminder that God cares and connects to the world, and in putting them in such a way that we would not be accidentally led towards worshiping them or idolizing them, because the math doesn't work. Questions or comments on Rambam's logic?
In terms of how that is played out today, when we do the Kedusha, we acknowledge that we're in this world, that there is this other world and other messengers and other servants. And this is also a visual representation of that theologically. So when people are looking at the whole setup, it's a reminder, I may be here on the outside as a servant, but Adonai has other servants.
Yes. And the plural being the very important thing, because all of them in the Kedusha are saying, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, Adonai Tzivaot, which is the ultimate title that God wears when we are emphasizing God as ruling over all of the forces that have been created that stretch from one end of the universe to the other, that they are all subservient to that same one God. Exactly. Now, coming back to the description of what they might have looked like, we get a very interesting text that's taken from Yoma, from the Talmud. And in it, we can see, well, I'll let it speak for itself, and then we'll discuss. Rav Katina said, when the Jewish people would ascend for one of the pilgrimage festivals, that is to say for Pesach, Shavuot, or Sukkot, the priests would roll up the curtain for them and show them the cherubs which were clinging to one another, and say to them, see how you are beloved before God, like the love of a male and female. So what they are saying is that the people would stand at the outer gate to the courtyard of the section where the temple was, and the doors would be open, the curtains would be inside, and the people would be able to see in to that area, to be able to see what was normally hidden from view. And the depiction of the cherubim that were inside was that they were not only human, but in fact rendered as both male and female, and that they were representative of the love between God and us, just as we would feel about the passion between the love between a husband and wife. Indeed, this is very much in keeping with the metaphorical reading of Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, which reads the entirety of that book as being a love poem between God and the Jewish people. So this is saying that that was played out in the depiction of the cherubim inside the tapestries of the temple. Now, Reish Lakish points out that this might be misunderstood. Indeed was. Reish Lakish said, when Gentiles destroyed the second temple, that is to say the Romans, and entered the sanctuary, they saw the cherubs clinging to one another. They saw the depictions of these male and female forms embracing. They took them out to the market and said, these Jews, whose blessing is a blessing and whose curse is a curse, they be occupied with such matters, right? It's like, these people are so holy and all that, and they've got pornography hanging up in their temple. Now, obviously, it's a bit rich for the Romans to be pointing any fingers about pornography, but to have that level of misunderstanding, to assume that a male and female image is inherently sexual, rather than symbolic of the love that exists between them, rather than the mere attraction of them to each other, is the fundamental flaw that was made not only by the Romans, but unfortunately by many people to this day. That to look at a cherub as something that, yes, can be fear-inducing and yes, can be terrifying, but to also see in it a symbol of the love between the Jewish people and the God and the Jewish people, is a very, very powerful symbol and very powerful statement. However, the Romans didn't care for it. They immediately debased and destroyed them. As it is stated, all who honored her debase her because they have seen her nakedness. So far from being something that would be a small toddler, they see these as being human forms that could have been sexualized in the eyes of those who were thinking that way. And unfortunately, that became part of their mocking and destruction during the fall of the Second Temple. But there are other ways to look at the two angels that viewed one another. And one of those is from Kitzur Bal HaTurim, which is just too good to leave out of our discussion. He said, their faces look at each other like two friends debating words of Torah. Traditionally, we study in what is known as chavruta, in a friendship group, meaning two people sitting across from each other in the table and arguing about what the Torah says, what the Mishnah says, what the Talmud says. And he sees those two the symbol of those two melachim on the top of the ark as being like that this is representative of two friends that are sitting together and wrestling with the Torah. Which again is a beautiful beautiful image of both intimacy as well as affection for each other, because you don't engage in this kind of chavruta study without being willing to care about the other person, since you will be debating tooth and nail over all of your points. Now, there's two more interpretations that I'd like to finish off with. So let's go with the first from Chizkuni here. And again, we're talking about the style and form of these two angels and what they might have meant. And they are to face one another, as we saw the two angels on top of the ark. This detail proves that these cherubs were not to be intended to be deities to be worshipped. Else they would have faced their onlookers so that they could prostrate themselves in front of them. In pagan temples, as he would have been well aware, the deity is facing out to the congregation so that the congregation can bow down in front of them. The congregation doesn't bow to the side of the deity, which is facing some other deity. They would need to be facing the people for that emotion to be done. However, they faced each other. Why? Seeing that they faced each other is clear proof that they had no interest in any onlooker. Furthermore, though their wings were pointing upwards, remember, lamala, their faces were looking down at the lid. That is to say, the space from which God's words would emanate to Moses and the area in which the Torah was kept. The most important proof that they were not meant to be worshipped by anyone is the fact that they were in a place that was inaccessible to the people on pain of death. Their function, therefore, was merely to be servants of God rather than God's competitors. They were put into the Holy of Holies. This was not a place that people would be able to see under normal circumstances, only during the Mishkan days when it would march with the ark out. But this was the way it was hidden. You don't put your most venerated idol in a place that no one can actually get sight of it. That's not how idolatry normally works. But more importantly, their arms went up and their faces went down. They were clearly acting as servants to God, and their entire posture was designed to remind us of that structure, and probably by specific deliberation, meant to remind the Kohanim, the actual human servants of the temple and Mishkan, that they were servants of God. Before we run out of time, I just want to finish off with Abarbanel's beautiful poetic idea of this embracing of the people and why, again, we might think of them as having this human elements. I think the cherubs had the form of young humans without any blemish and having never tasted sin. One was in the form of a male and the other female. This hints at the idea that anybody in Israel, man or woman, should dedicate their life to the study and practice of the Torah. They faced each other with their wings up high to symbolize that any Jew should have their thoughts and wings raised upwards, thinking of worshiping God in matters that concern God. But one's face should be towards the others, symbolizing the love and solidarity between all people. So again, this Ark of the Covenant was not merely decorative, but Abarbanel is hinting that there were powerful lessons to be learned from its structure, that male and female would have both been used in order to remind us that everybody should be dedicated to Torah, that their wings were up so that our thoughts would be up, but that their faces were towards each other because we need to be with each other as well. Judaism is not, as I've said repeatedly at other times, a monastic tradition. It is not about isolating and hermiting ourselves away. It is about being together with each other. Sometimes that can be intention, but that doesn't mean there can't also be love and solidarity. And I think that's a beautiful way to consider these cherubim, that yes, there is a level of power and of fear-inducing awe that is coming from all of this, but it is also meant to be an invitation and instruction for how to live. And we will finish there. Any questions or thoughts?
I have a question. How do you discern or determine in which context the cherubim have human face and in which context they're an ox face? And I ask that because I'm looking at a comment by Ibn Ezra, who says, the sages comparing this word to Aramaic kerabia, like boys, said the cherubim had the faces of boys. If they had this as a tradition and were merely using the Aramaic as a memory device, fine. But etymologically, there is no connection. Moreover, the faces could be the same as an ox, and the verse here does not explain what form they are to take.
Exactly. So short answer of when do we know they would have been more human and when do we know they would have been more ox-like or even bird-like, like Rashbam suggested?
We don't know.
The very fact that Ibn Ezra is arguing with the Chachamim and the very fact that Rashbam was arguing with his grandfather Rashi tells us that we don't have photos of exactly what they look like in the tapestries or on the ark. And we definitely don't have photos of the the personal, private experience of the different Nevi'im, of the different prophets. So we will never know for sure precisely what they looked like. We can get some general descriptions, and we can have some reasonable guesses based upon the texts that are found scattered throughout the Tanakh, as well as the interpretations of our sages. But anyone who says they know what biblical angels look like usually is trying to sell the painting or posters that they have on the back of their stall at the flea market. That's just not something we're ever going to be able to say with confidence. Ba'olam hazeh, in this world. Ba'olam haba, sure, in the world to come, we'll understand. But in the meantime, I think it's more powerful to learn from what their form might have indicated and what purpose they might have served, than to punch each other over precisely what face they were wearing at any given time.
I'm just awestruck by the fact that they are fellow servants.
Absolutely, and it's a good reminder of the fact that, as we say in the Kedusha explicitly, that we can rise to be in their company, and that is a great testament to what human beings can be. Should we choose to move that way? Should we let go of our guilt and feel remorse and do tshuva, as Radak said way back at the beginning of our class?
And I think there's a line in Zechariah: if you heed my ways and obey my word, you shall stride with the angels.
Yes.
Zechariah, yeah. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, and be well, everyone. Take care, and see some of you tonight for Mishnah, and others maybe tomorrow for Pathway to Judaism.
Thank you. Thank you.